So I would like to welcome you to this first lecture of the Pour Dawood lecture series at the Pour Dawood Center. In a moment, my dear colleague, Professor Carter, shall be introducing my wonderful colleague, Dr. Soroush, who's specializing in Iranian archaeology, in particular in the irrigations of the ancient world and the Canals system, both in Iran and outside of it, as we discussed. But that shall be obviously a task that Dr. Carter should be doing by far more aptly than I am. I would just like to mention a few thoughts with you. We would like, on behalf of the Pour Dawood Center, express our sympathy and great sorrow for the victims of the flooding in Iran and the fact that we, unfortunately, are incapable of providing any relief and help due to the sanctioned regime presently in place. But we will hope that we might inform the community around the Pour Dawood Center if we find a solution to provide some help and relief to those in great need. I just wanted to have expressed this notion to you that we are obviously under a lot of duress at the present stage and time in Iran. Without further ado, I would like to welcome my dear colleague and give her the floor to introduce Professor Dr. Soroush. Thank you. I did it in the German fashion, Professor Doctor. Thank you.
It's my great pleasure today to introduce to you our speaker, who comes to us only from Walnut Creek, so not too far. But she did her BA and her MA in architecture at Tehran University, became interested in cultural heritage management, worked for a number of years, including preparing the UNESCO report on the waterworks in Shushtar. Eventually, she ended up in the US, and I think that's where I first met her, when I gave a seminar at the University of Pennsylvania, and she was a young student, a young and promising student then. And she eventually moved to the Institute at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World, or ISA, at New York University, where she completed her PhD under Professor Dan Potts. Title: Irrigated Landscapes Beyond the Empire, Long-Term Dynamics of Water Management on the Mianab Plain of Khuzestan, so southeast of Shushtar. She has an edited volume, a special issue of the Journal of Ancient History, written or edited with Richard Payne, called The Archaeology of Sasanian Politics. And as she told us at lunch, she's working on that wonderful publication of her dissertation, and we hope that we'll see it soon. She also is currently working with Professor Jason Uhr at Harvard on a long-term project looking at qanats and other water features in the Near East via declassified corona satellite imagery. So being able to do some of this work, at least at home, without going into the field, and then going into the field and checking it. Her talk today is entitled The Lords of Canals and Bridges, Re-examining the Sasanian Hydraulic Landscapes and Their Heritage in the Islamic Period. There's an archaeological book called Altering the Earth. And for those of you who know Khuzestan, and I count myself fortunate as having been there, this idea of altering the earth was certainly something in the mind of the Sasanian builders, and we'll hear it today in her talk about the water management systems and their relationship to the building of the empire. It's my pleasure to introduce Mehrnoush Soroush.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank so much Professor Carter for her very kind introduction, the Pour Dawood Center, especially Professor Shaigan for this kind invitation. It's my pleasure to present my work at this prestigious venue, and also Dr. Stevens for her hard work that makes this pleasant trip possible. Irrigation canals are the signature of the Sasanian landscapes. The Sasanian Empire was a highly centralized and powerful state that ruled over Iran and much of the Near East between the 3rd and 7th centuries of the Common Era. We know that the Sasanian kings built waterworks that were unsurpassed in scale and capacity until the modern time. We know that these monumental canal systems, A, supported the empire's massive program of urbanization, and B, maximize the tax revenue of the state, which was primarily an agrarian economy. We know that the Sasanian kings used the labor of the war deportees to build these canal systems and maintain their functionality through the supervision of the state's centralized administration. We know that, but let us pause here. Do we really know all of this? In this talk, I'm going to focus on what we don't know about the Sasanian water management and on what we think we know, but we might not know well enough or at all. My discussion will revolve around 3 main topics: the data of the canal systems, the agency behind the construction and the maintenance of the canal systems, and the significance of irrigation for the Sasanian state. Let's start with the problem of date. The idea that if irrigation is substantial in a landscape, it dates to the Sasanian period. How we know if a canal is Sasanian? Unfortunately, there is little in terms of contemporary textual sources that tell us if a canal or any other hydraulic structure was built in the Sasanian period. Medieval Muslim authors credited some of the powerful Sasanian kings with the construction of major hydraulic projects, most famously the Nahrawan Canal in southern Iraq, as well as the Nahrawan Canal, modern Gargar, and the Weir Bridge of Shadorwan in southwestern Iran. Early modern travelers built on this and described the impressive ruins that were left of the Sasanian hydraulic infrastructures, especially in southern Iraq and southwestern Iran. But until the 1950s, our understanding of the Sasanian hydraulic projects was fragmentary, lacking a big picture perspective. The person who first created a big picture perspective of the Sasanian irrigation was Robert McCormick Adams from the University of Chicago Oriental Institute. He built on a new idea and developed a technique for the fast and relatively reliable dating of settlements and irrigation canals. With the power of the new method and his sheer relentlessness, from the 1950s to 1970s, he surveyed much of the lower Iraq and southwestern Iran and created a large database of dated sites and canals. Findings suggest that irrigation systems grew bigger and more complex over time. There is a correlation between the growth in the power and complexity of the state systems and the extent and complexity of systems. But was there a causal relationship too? That is, did strong states build large canal systems? He proposed so, and the Sasanians were pivotal in his argument. Why? Because around the Sasanian period, irrigation systems reached their maximum extent and complexity, after which there was a continuous decline and retraction in canal irrigation until the modern time. Historical data suggested that the Sasanian state was the most powerful and centralized ancient polity that ever ruled over Iraq and Iran, very different from the loose federation of the Parthian overlords and the chaotic period of Islamic rule. These premises solidified Adams' findings into a theory of Sasanian irrigation. This theory basically says that territorial states and their centralized power were necessary for the construction and maintenance of large-scale irrigation infrastructures. The proof is that the largest and the most technically complex canal systems in the history of the Near East were built under the rule of the Sasanians, who maintained a highly centralized state. Further proof for this causality is that the Sasanian irrigation systems fell into disrepair and collapsed after the Islamic conquest of the empire. This narrative has a major caveat: the uncertainty of the dating. So let's review how the canals are dated in Adam's surface reconnaissance technique that has become the standard method of canal dating in Near Eastern archaeology. Surface reconnaissance technique is based on the assumption that settlements in arid fluvial landscapes could have not existed without a permanent source of water, the canal that transported water from the river. So if we have a canal segment, and if we can find two settlements of the same date along it, the canal was of the same date as the two settlements. For example, let's see. For example, this is our earlier period, phase 1 and phase 2, and then we can say that this canal dated to the phase 1, and also for the later periods like here. The problem is that our dating assemblages, that is the group of pottery representing a historical period, like the Sasanian period, are poorly defined for many periods, but particularly for the first millennium CE. The Sasanian assemblages consist mostly of the utilitarian pottery that were A, in circulation for extremely long periods of time before and after the Sasanian rule, and were B, often local, therefore prohibiting us from using one region's assemblage for the dating of sites in another region. It is therefore nearly impossible to reliably differentiate the Sasanian sites from the earlier and later periods. Therefore, period maps, for example, the Sasanian settlement map or the Islamic settlement map, are basically a subjective selection by the archaeologists to put what site on which period map. This choice is often guided by a priori assumptions about the historical context. Let's see how this uncertainty and subjectivity may lead our interpretations to different directions. Let's say we have dated 4 sites based on the assemblages dating to the 2nd to 4th century CE and 5th to 8th century CE. So we want to look at this left picture first. Let's see, we have these 2 sites date to 2nd to 4th CE, which is still a much narrower date that we have for most of our pottery compared to what we have for most of the pottery. And these are another assemblage, 5th to 8th. If we take a 50% chance and assign each of the 2 sites to one end of this time range, this data will represent settlement continuity and the gradual expansion of a canal system. Because we have a Parthian sites here, so we have a Parthian canal, and then we can put decide that this site belonged to the first end, 5th century, so it's a Sasanian one. This one belonged to the end of this period, an early Sasanian one, and this one belonged to the late end of that period, early Islamic. That means this canal that supported the Parthian site was already in existence in the Parthian period. This canal was added in the Sasanian period, and that one still was relying on the main canal. And then this segment was added to provide for the early Islamic period site. Now, look at the right picture. If I put all these sites on the Sasanian period map, based on the assumption that it is more likely that these sites were founded in the Sasanian period as opposed to the Parthian and Islamic period, the same data will suggest the opposite scenario, a sharp expansion in the Sasanian period and a sudden decline afterward, because there's nothing before and after the Sasanians on this map. Because period maps are generally built in this way, as opposed to this way, we are in a vicious circle of reaffirming our a priori assumptions with the new data. Interestingly, even with this bias, the contrast between the Sasanian site maps and the preceding Parthian or succeeding Islamic site maps is often not very sharp. The map symbology is used to highlight the contrast. Let's see what I mean. Let's take Adam's map of the Nahrawan site canal system as an example. Well, remember, Nahrawan is the biggest project attributed to the Sasanian kings. As you can see, there is not much difference either in the number of the sites or the distribution of the Sasanian versus the Parthian period. So Parthian comes before the Sasanians. This is the map of the Parthian period. Look at where sites are and their number. Basically, they're the same. There's not that much difference between the 2 sites. where the sites are and how many sites we have. Therefore, most canals that fed the Sasanian site must have existed to provide for the Parthian sites too. If it's not clear, stop me. I will wait more, because that's fundamental in my argument. Therefore, most canals that fed the Sasanian site must have existed to provide for the Parthian sites too. Adams admits this ambiguity and hints to a precursor of the Nahrawan canal. But note that the canal lines are drawn in dotted light red lines for the Parthian period map, and in bold dark red for the Sasanian period map. So look at these canals. They all exist here too. It's just lighter and looks like they did not exist. This is a purely subjective choice that renders the Parthian canal systems as piecemeal and a small scale, and renders the Sasanian system as integrated and monumental. Probably only the upper part of the Nahrawan canal was not in place in the Parthian period. The Nahrawan canal was probably equally important for the sites in the Islamic period as well, because the distinction between a Sasanian assemblage and an Islamic assemblage, especially in non-elite contexts, cannot be made until the 9th and 10th centuries, which is 2 to 3 centuries after the Sasanian rule. Noting these biases in the existing literature, I decided to personally study the irrigation history on the Mehrnoush plain. The Mehrnoush is encircled by the Karun River, the largest river of Iran, to the west, and by the Gargar Canal to the east. Gargar, or the early Islamic Masraqan Canal, is one of the most renowned canals attributed to the early Sasanian kings. The ancient city of Shushtar is mentioned as a destination for the Roman deportees in the Sasanian period, and has been until now continuously inhabited. Previous studies had suggested that on the Mehrnoush too, settlement and irrigation activity maximized under the Sasanians and declined afterwards. I use remote sensing of historical imagery, satellite and aerial imagery, and combine it with my own fieldwork as well as previously collected archaeological data to create a database of the sites and ancient canals on the Mehrnoush. To avoid the previously discussed bias, I put all of the sites that could have been occupied in any period on that period map. Given that our 3 time periods are all about 4 centuries, they are equally biased in terms of the higher site density that this approach creates. As you can see with this approach, the Sasanian settlements do not differ markedly from the earlier or later periods. The Sasanian is the middle one. And this is Parthian, the first one, and this is Islamic. If anything, there is new settlement activity south of plain in the Islamic period here, new sites. I have discussed this growth elsewhere in my publication, and in the interest of time, I have to skip elaborating on it. In the areas with incredibly long history of irrigation, such as Mesopotamia and southwestern Iran, continuity in irrigation practices is in fact not surprising at all. Early canals were always built on the relict water channels, and canal systems grew bigger in the course of the increasingly more complex actions of humans in channel straightening and expansion. This continuous growth is even more notable for larger and more complex canals such as Nahrawan and Gargar, as discussed previously for the Nahrawan by Michael Moroney and studied by myself for Gargar. These large and impressive projects were complex, multi-period systems. They were engineered in the Sasanian period by building new canal systems into a pre-existing system of canals. Moreover, the general continuity between the Sasanian and early Islamic settlement patterns in much of the Mesopotamia and southwestern Iran implies that these long-lived canal systems continued to function for centuries after the fall of the empire, Sasanian Empire. Revision in dating has an important implication. It pushes us to rethink our assumptions about the agency behind the construction and maintenance of the Sasanian canals. More specifically, rethinking the idea that if there is Sasanian canal irrigation, the state was involved. When talking about agency, it is important to distinguish between the construction and the operation of an irrigation system. The lack of the Sasanian administrative archives precludes us from knowing how much a state was involved in either aspect. Yet the strong continuity in irrigation between the Parthian and early Islamic periods in many regions suggests that the central government had little to do with the operation of irrigation. The continuity in the operation of canal systems over many centuries also suggests that canal building and maintenance activities were generally undertaken independent of the states. This is because river-based canal irrigation requires constant rebuilding and re-engineering in response to the dynamics of sedimentation and river channel movements. But let us see what evidence we do have for the Sasanian royal constructions. The association of the Sasanian kings with canal building projects is to a large degree inferred from their presumed necessity for the Sasanian urbanization programs. The Sasanian kings built, rebuilt, renamed numerous cities, many of which cities were in southern Iraq and southwestern Iran, where the existence of the associated irrigation infrastructure is unquestionable. That said, our strongest candidates for royal canal building projects in relation to urban expansion programs are the two canals of Nahrawan in southern Iraq, which supported Ctesiphon, and Gargar in southwestern Iran, which supported Shushtar. In both cases, state involvement in their construction is based on the truly monumental scale of the canal, the texture sources that name a specific canal segment after a specific king, and the typology of the new canal segment that stand us from the rest of the existing system. Some other Sasanian cities, for example, Ivan Karkhe and Jundishapur in southwestern Iran, have notable waterworks too. I will discuss later why I don't include them as clear example of royal canal building. The link between urbanization and royal canal building elsewhere, outside Mesopotamia and southwestern Iran, is generally more speculative. Many Sasanian cities are unidentified on the ground, so the discussion of the royal irrigation system is irrelevant. Those that are identified, in many cases, were not supported by canal irrigation. This is especially the case outside the irrigation-heavy southern Mesopotamia and southwestern Iran. For example, in the case of the royal cities in the Sasanian homeland, Fars. If the cities have canal systems, it is not of a scale that requires royal agency. Let me elaborate more on the scale problem. Scale, in my view, is an unproductive topic in the discourse of the Sasanian waterworks because it is subjective and undefined. The inconsistent utilization of the words largest scale and monumental to any Sasanian context opens the door to subjectively talk about central planning and central management. Often, there's nothing in the scale of most of the canals in the Sasanian context that requires state engineering. Let's look at this example. The archaeological survey of the Mogan Plain in northwestern Iran recorded a Sasanian system of fortified settlements with extramural settlements and irrigation canals that were developed in a previously rain-fed plain. So these are the Sasanian sites. This is a beautiful Sasanian context because this was a dry farming area. And then about 5th century, in the middle of Sasanian period, we have this expansion of settlements. Fortified ones, as you can see, this is an example, and all of them have extramural settlements, and then they have some irrigation canals along them that you can see here too. I choose to discuss the Mogan Plain because this is one of the best studies and one of the largest Sasanian period canal irrigation systems. Still, every canal segment is about 10 to 15 meters wide, and the segments between the sites are generally between 15 to 30 kilometers long. This is not a feat beyond the capacity of the private landlords. Now let me go back to why I left Jundishapur and Ivan Karkhe, the famous Sasanian cities, aside as clear examples of royal canal building. It is because the striking continuity in urban life and water management across the entire subplains of Susiana, which is northern Khuzestan, in the Islamic period, makes it extremely hard to separate the Islamic period investments from the Sasanian investment. I started my detailed study of water history on the Miana Plain because Shushtar has had uninterrupted occupation since the Sasanian period. But other cities of Sasanian period too were occupied for several centuries after the Islamic conquest, especially if textual evidence is also taken into account. Although the prevailing assumption is that the Sasanian waterworks fell into decline in the Islamic period, there is ample evidence for continued hydraulic investment across Susiana. Far from being a monolithic single-phase piece of engineering, these infrastructures are composed of several layers of activity, evident in the diversity in their size, layout, and building techniques. For example, there is a wadi to the west of Jundishapur, the Siyah Mansur Wadi. This wadi, and Jundishapur is here. An underground tunnel was first discovered in the 1960s by Adams that transported water from underneath the wadi into the city. This is often known as the one here, this one. This is the famous Sasanian structure. This is often known as the Sasanian siphon of Jundishapur. However, recent flooding, not very recent, few years before, of the wadi revealed another tunnel to the north of it, this one, built with different material and technique. So earlier, I highlighted the continuity in the operation of the Sasanian waterworks as inferred from settlement patterns. Here, I talked about the continuity in the construction of the waterworks, as inferred from multi-period nature of the hydraulic infrastructures. This overall continuity suggests that agents other than the state were behind many of the Sasanian hydraulic projects, allowing for these initiatives to continue after the fall of the empire. There is some evidence for such investment from the textual sources and archaeological data. For example, it is tempting to identify the Mogan steppe settlements, which I discussed earlier, with the Persian term dastkar. Dastkar signifies a rural estate, including a residence that is often fortified, various outbuildings, and probably irrigation infrastructure, as well as the land it cultivated. Dastkar could apply to the state of various scale. But the relatively modest size of the Mogan steppe settlement suggests that they were the domains of minor landed nobility. Tabari reports land grants to private individuals in the Sasanian period, for example, around Qazvin. Tabari is a famous Islamic historian. So in Qazvin, which is not far from Mogan, that may have looked similar on the ground. We know from the early Islamic period about the importance of land reclamation through irrigation projects. Similar impetus seem to have existed in the Sasanian period too. Jewish and Zoroastrian legal texts suggest that the building of large canals at the scale of a public infrastructure was a means to acquire the adjacent land and proprietary water rights. We also know that wealthy individuals set aside a portion of their wealth for charitable purposes, including public infrastructures such as hydraulic projects. We also know of the Middle Persian term hambai, or partnership in economic investments, such as in the construction of irrigation canals. So why the literature tends to overstress the role of the state at the expense of other players? The reason is perhaps a Mesopotamian-centric overemphasis on the significance of irrigation agriculture for the Sasanian state. The notion that if a landscape is Sasanian, it was irrigated. Note that I'm questioning the significance of irrigation agriculture, not agriculture per se. The consensus is that the purpose of the Sasanian imperial irrigation projects was to maximize agricultural revenues by two means. First, they expanded irrigation agriculture to all arable lands, even in the marginal ones. Second, they maximized production in agricultural lands via investment in the summer cultivation of cash crops, such as cotton, rice, and sugarcane. The association of the Sasanian settlements and irrigation systems is most clear in southern Mesopotamia and southwestern Iran. Outside these irrigation-heavy regions, there is no proof that the Sasanian settlements always relied on irrigation. Recent years have witnessed a surge in the archaeological surveys in the Sasanian homeland, Fars. The large number of the Sasanian sites in the arid and semi-arid plains of Fars is taken as a proof for the expansion of irrigation to these regions, even though no material evidence of such systems have been retrieved. The belief that irrigation was expanded to the limits of arable land leads to another problem, the assumption that all Islamic irrigation systems originated in the Sasanian period. This assumption has led to the studies that discuss the Sasanian water history based completely on irrigation infrastructures dated to the early Islamic period. The urge to find irrigation in every single Sasanian context relates to the hypothesis of cash cropping in the Sasanian period. Unlike winter cultivation, summer cultivation of cash crops requires irrigation. We know that rice, cotton, and sugarcane were intensively cultivated by the 10th century CE in southern Iraq and southwestern Iran. Because rice and cotton were cultivated in the Sasanian period too, and because irrigation is thought to have reached its zenith in the Sasanian period, some scholars postulate that the Islamic boom in cash cropping must simply be a continuation of the Sasanian agricultural practices. But what are the direct evidence for Sasanian cash cropping? There is no information on sugar cultivation in the Sasanian period. Cotton was certainly planted in the Sasanian period, as it was planted for millennia before as a food crop. We don't know if cotton was cultivated on a larger scale as a fiber crop in the Sasanian period. Rice was probably cultivated in southwestern Iran even before the Sasanian period. But until the Middle Ages, rice was a luxury grain used in the smallest quantities in certain elite dishes. It appears that only in southern Iraq and southwestern Iran, rice was cultivated on a notable scale for local consumption, again, not for trade. The two main taxable cultivars of the Sasanian period, namely wheat and barley, are food items and are winter crops. If winter cropping was the foundation of the Sasanian agrarian economy, there is no reason to assume that irrigation was equally important across the Sasanian territories. An interesting case is in the Gorgan wall. The wall, so this is the legendary Gorgan wall marked in red, and it cuts off the earlier irrigation canals that would irrigate the arid steppe to the east of the Caspian Sea. So this wall basically encloses a productive dry farm plain inside the Sasanian defended territory. Even in southwestern Iran, Sasanians probably built canals for reasons other than irrigation as well. Despite the dominance of the irrigation discourse, the scholars seem to have difficulty explaining the economic rationale of the Sasanian canal projects in terms only of irrigation. One problem is that the Sasanian royal cities of Ivan-e-Karkhe and Jundishapur moved away from the most agriculturally productive land to the zone of dry farming. Moreover, the Sasanian early Islamic canals are expansive and make sense to have been used for winter irrigation when there's a lot of water. But such investments are too expensive for winter crops only. They were probably not used for summer irrigation either because summer flow is low in Khuzestan, and the Sasanian waterworks do not include water storage facilities like big reservoirs. They're just dams, weirs that create a certain level of water. It is surprising that these problems raised by various scholars have not led to the consideration of functions other than irrigation. I closely examined the Gargar Canal in southwestern Iran. Gargar has been always known as a major irrigation canal, built to intensify agriculture around Shushtar. I carried out a high-resolution mapping of the relic canals around Shushtar from historical, satellite, and aerial imagery. So I mapped about 2,300 canal segments one by one, and this is the result. Based on the hydraulic and topographic analysis of these canal segments, I demonstrated that no irrigation canal was ever fed from Gargar. My strongest guess for the function of this canal is flood control. It is relevant to talk about flood control measurements in the past while Iran is unfortunately hit by severe floods. You may have heard in the news about flooding at Shiraz's Darwaza Quran Gate because the old moat or wadi that protected the city from the floods was filled. So this is the famous gate to the city that sits at the foot of the mountain, where the water would come in large quantities from the river. And there was always a moat or a wadi, a dry wadi, that protected the city from the floods. In recent years, they had filled this wadi and created a parking lot. And this is the aftermath and the deadliest. Although the entire country is flooded, like the most violent flood, the deadliest event is here. Only about, I think, 25 people were dead in just one, only here, because this moat was filled. Compared to Shiraz, floods are more frequent and even larger in scale in Shushtar. Shushtar sits at the head of the alluvial fan of Karun. The strategic hydraulic advantages of this location are accompanied by the constant threat of spring floods. I speculate that Gargar was built as a major flood control mechanism, into which other supplementary functions such as milling and navigation were subsequently built. To conclude, I suggested a reconsideration in our assumptions about the Sasanian canal irrigation in the three aspects of dating, agency, and significance. First, the Sasanian period is a fundamentally important time in the water history of the Near East. Irrigation agriculture was expanded to new areas, the existing systems were enhanced and scaled, new techniques of irrigation proliferated. However, the uncertainty in the dating of these irrigation canals leaves us only to speculate as to how the Sasanian practices were different from the earlier and later periods. Second, it is important to distinguish between the Sasanian period investments and the Sasanian state investments. The general continuity in irrigation and settlement patterns between the Parthian, Sasanian, and early Islamic period in most regions suggests that the operation of irrigation was not handled by the states. In terms of construction, only a portion of all the Sasanian investment in irrigation were probably built or even sponsored by the state. It appears that over the course of the first millennium CE, canal irrigation technology became increasingly more affordable and more accessible to the different sectors of the society. The Sasanian state seemed to have encouraged land development projects by protecting the economic rights of the individuals and communities who invested in public canal infrastructures. Finally, canal irrigation in southern Mesopotamia and southwestern Iran increased during the Sasanian period. The base of the Sasanian agrarian economy, however, seems to have been subsistence agriculture focused on winter cropping. Some of the Sasanian period canal building activities may have been related to the gradual increase in the significance of cash crops. But much like today, during the Sasanian periods, canals were needed to fulfill a variety of purposes other than irrigation. I thank you all for your attention.